Graham Foster stood in the doorway of the Buckley Animal Rescue, the smell of disinfectant and damp concrete clinging to the air like a second skin. He hesitated just long enough for the door to thud shut behind him, echoing through the hall of metal cages. The last place he thought he'd find himself on a Saturday morning was here, surrounded by barking restless energy and the hum of fluorescent lights. But a promise was a promise. His brother Tyler had made him swear he'd try to open his heart again, try to believe that maybe something good could still come walking into his life. He shoved his hands deeper into the pockets of his worn coat and followed the sound of clanging food bowls and panting kennels lined both sides of the narrow hall, each holding a dog eager for attention. Except one kennel number 7 was quiet. That's what caught his attention amid the chaos. This one didn't bark, didn't pace, didn't even twitch. The German shepherd inside sat at the very back of the cage, its fur and unkempt map of silver and brown. One of its eyes was clouded, the other sharp and yellow, like it was still holding on to something, watching the world with a kind of tired intelligence. It didn't move when Graham approached, just stared. A woman pushing a mop noticed him lingering. "That one's a quiet soul," she said, stopping to rest on the handle. "Name's on the tag, though nobody really calls him that, doesn't respond to it." Graham squinted through the bars. "What's his story?" She gave a sigh that was all too familiar in tone. "No chip, no history. Just showed up one morning. That tag's all he had on him." He crouched to get a better look. The tag was brass, dulled with age, and worn around the edges like it had survived a long life of weather and time. He leaned in, reading the inscription. "If you're reading this, I was loved." Once the words hit him like a hand to the chest. Something about the way the dog looked at him, the stillness of it, the dignity even in its worn-down body. It reminded him of that first morning, after Lillian passed, how the silence had felt so loud. He hadn't realized how much he'd been living in that same silence. "Every day since he's older." The woman added, her voice softer now. 10, maybe more. Doesn't make a fuss. Doesn't beg. Doesn't chase balls or wag his tail. When people walk by. Been here 6 months now, we're out of time. He's on the list for Tuesday." Graham stood slowly. "You're going to put him down." Her pause was all the answer he needed. He turned back to the dog, who still hadn't moved. "What's the name on the tag?" he asked. "Murphy," she said, "but like I said, he doesn't really answer to it." Murphy. The name settled into Graham's chest like it belonged there. Maybe the dog didn't need to answer to it, but it mattered that someone remembered it. He should have walked away. He wasn't ready for this. Wasn't ready for the commitment, the heartbreak, the chance that he'd get attached only to lose again. But the tag, those words, the look in that one clear eye. Graham found himself speaking before his thoughts caught up. "I'll take him." The woman blinked. "You sure? I mean, we can give you some time. Maybe meet some of the younger ones first." "No," he said more firmly. "Now I want him." She nodded and disappeared down the hall for the keys. Graham crouched again in front of the kennel. "Murphy," he said gently, "looks like you're coming home." The dog didn't respond, didn't wag, but didn't back away either. When the door swung open, Murphy didn't bolt. He rose like someone getting out of bed after a long illness. Slow, careful, deliberate. His joints creaked audibly. Graham stepped back to give him room, but the old shepherd walked right to his side and stood there, not touching, not leaning, just present, like a shadow that had always been there, but only now decided to show itself outside. The air was colder than Graham expected. He opened the passenger door of his truck and patted the seat up. "You go." Murphy looked at the seat, then back at Graham for a moment. He thought the dog might refuse, but then slowly, with a huff, Murphy climbed in and curled into a tight circle. No whine, no complaint. The drive back to Graham's house was quiet, not uncomfortable, not awkward, just quiet at home. Murphy took one slow lap of the living room, sniffed the baseboards, then found the edge of a worn-out rug and lay down. Graham stood in the doorway, unsure what to do next. "I guess I should feed you," he said. Murphy made no response, just lowered his head to his paws and closed his eyes. Graham didn't know how long he stood there, long enough for the afternoon sun to slip across the hardwood floor and rest on Murphy's back like a blessing, long enough for something in his chest to loosen. Not fully, but enough. This wasn't supposed to be permanent. That's what he told himself. But as he watched the dog sleep, the brass tag still glinting faintly under the fur, he felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope Murphy didn't bark. Not once. Not when the doorbell rang. Not when a car pulled into the driveway. Not even at the neighborhood cat that occasionally slinked across the front porch like it owned the place. In those first few days, Graham found himself listening for noise, out of habit, waiting for a jingle of tags, a sharp yelp at the mailman, a thump of paws against the hardwood, but none ever came instead. There was silence, but not the kind Graham had grown used to, the heavy, crushing stillness that had settled over his house after Lillian died. This silence was softer. Breathing. It had weight. Yes, but it didn't press on his chest. It moved through the rooms with the gentle rhythm of Murphy's footsteps, the occasional sigh as the dog lay down near the couch or followed Graham from room to room, never demanding, only present. It surprised Graham how quickly the routine began to shift. Mornings used to be mechanical. Coffee brewed on autopilot, news murmuring in the background, him staring blankly out the kitchen window. Now there were 2 mugs on the table, his and a second ceramic one filled with water. For Murphy, who sat by the door like a silent sentry, watching the sunlight creep in across the floor. They walked every evening, not far, just around the neighborhood, past the bakery that closed too early and the small bookstore that always smelled like cinnamon. Murphy walked beside him without a leash, never straying, always just a step behind. Graham talked sometimes. Not much, but enough little things supposed to rain tomorrow. Or that lady at the corners got the best roses in town. Or I didn't sleep well last night. Murphy never responded, of course. But his ears would twitch. His head would turn just slightly, and Graham liked to imagine he was listening. Really listening. He found himself slowing down, in ways he hadn't before, sitting on the porch longer in the evenings, watching the light filter through the trees, eating his breakfast at the table, instead of over the sink, folding laundry to the sound of Murphy's breathing in the next room. The pace of his days, once driven by grief and avoidance, began to find a gentler rhythm, one shaped not by productivity, but by presence. Murphy never begged for attention. He didn't nudge or whine, but he was always there in the doorway of Graham's home office, under the kitchen table, while he read the paper, stretched across the threshold of the bedroom as if standing guard. His silence wasn't empty. It was full of something unspoken, a quiet loyalty that Graham hadn't realized he'd been missing. It was during one of their morning walks to the park that Graham noticed something new. A young boy sat alone on a bench near the edge of the playground. Arms wrapped tightly around his knees, Graham recognized him from down the street. Noah, the Thompson kid. The boy rarely spoke to anyone and never made eye contact. Word around the neighborhood was that he had anxiety issues, rarely left the house, and struggled at school. Murphy paused. Mid-step, he looked at the boy, then back at Graham, then slowly approached, not too fast, not too close, just enough. He sat down a few feet away from the bench, his body low, his head turned slightly to the side. Noah looked up. He didn't move at first, but then something shifted his shoulders, relaxed, and a tiny, barely there smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. He reached out a tentative hand. Murphy didn't react. He just stayed put, calm and steady until the boy leaned forward and gently brushed his fingers along Murphy's back. No barking, no flinching, just quiet contact. Graham stood there, struck, silent. He didn't want to intrude. It felt like watching something sacred unfold, something that didn't belong to him, but was still somehow meant to be witnessed later. When he told Mrs. Thompson about it, she cried, "That's the first time he's touched another living thing in months," she whispered. "Whatever that dog is, he's special." Graham didn't disagree. That night after dinner, he decided Murphy needed a bath. The old shepherd didn't protest. He stood in the tub like a statue, while Graham gently poured warm water over his matted coat, watching the dirt swirl down the drain underneath the grime. Murphy's fur gleamed a little, patchy still, but rich with strands of auburn and white. It was, when Graham was drying him off, that he noticed something, the brass tag he'd seen the front a dozen times already. Often tracing his thumb over the etched words, "If you're reading this, I was loved once." But as he turned it over, drying Murphy's neck with a towel, the tag twisted slightly in the light. There were markings on the back, faint, almost invisible beneath years of wear and scratches. But they were there. Letters. Maybe an address partially rubbed away but not gone. Graham leaned in, tilting the tag toward the bathroom mirror, angling the light. He could just make out a few numbers. A street name, he thought, possibly a town. His heart gave a small, unexpected leap. "Where did you come from, huh?" he asked softly. Murphy blinked up at him, tail thumping once against the side of the tub. That night Graham sat at the kitchen table, the tag laid out beside him, like a clue in a mystery he hadn't meant to solve. He found a pen and a notepad, stared at the blank page for a long moment, then began to write to whom it may concern. "I believe I may have your dog." It began with subtle things. Murphy started sleeping a little longer each morning, his bones stiff when he rose from the old rug by the fireplace. His once quiet steps were now slower, heavier. Graham tried not to read into it, tried not to panic when Murphy paused at the foot of the stairs or hesitated before getting into the truck. He reminded himself that time moved differently for older dogs, that slowing down was natural, but deep down, he knew Murphy was changing, not in spirit, not in heart, but in the wear and tear of a body that had traveled farther than most. Still, Graham didn't let it stop them. He began planning shorter walks, warmer meals, cozier afternoons, and he said yes when the librarian at Buckley's small-town library asked if he and Murphy would consider joining their new reading program for children with anxiety and trauma. "It's called Pause to Listen," she explained. "No pressure, just a kid, a book, and a dog who won't judge." Graham had paused, unsure. "Murphy's not trained for that sort of thing." "He doesn't need to be," she said. "Just being there is enough." So they went. The library's children's room was a cozy corner, full of beanbags and low bookshelves and faded rugs that smelled faintly of apples and dust. Graham took a seat near the window, and Murphy settled down at his feet. Without a sound, he didn't bark or stir when the first child sat across from them. A little boy named Owen, who read in whispers so soft Graham could barely hear them. But Murphy heard his ears twitched at every page turn, and when Owen stumbled over a word, Murphy didn't blink, didn't shift, just stayed solid and unbothered, like nothing in the world could shake him. The second week, a new child arrived. OPUI was small and thin and moved like she was used to making herself invisible. Talia, she didn't speak at first. She didn't even sit on the beanbag. She hovered in the doorway, clutching a battered copy of Charlotte's Web to her chest. Murphy looked up, not with excitement, not with urgency, just a quiet awareness. He blinked once, then rested his head on his paws. Talia stepped forward 1 foot, then another. Slowly she sat, opened the book, and read, She read in a broken whisper, her voice scratchy and uncertain, like she hadn't used it much lately. But page by page, word by word, something in her steadied her shoulders, relaxed. Her hands stopped shaking. Murphy didn't move, he lay still. The entire time, eyes half-lidded, tail occasionally thumping against the rug. When Talia paused, he blinked. When she looked unsure, he exhaled gently, just enough to remind her he was there. After an hour, she stood, walked over and placed her small hand on Murphy's head. "He listens," she whispered to Graham, and he did. That night, Graham sat on the porch with Murphy curled at his feet. The sky above them was a blur of stars, the air crisp with the bite of early fall. Graham held the letter in his hand, the one that had arrived that morning in an envelope with a return address he didn't recognize. It was written on thick stationery and careful script. Walter Beckett. He read it twice. Then again, "Dear Mr. Foster, thank you for your letter. You cannot imagine what it meant to receive those words, to see a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in years. If your dog is truly wearing the tag I once fastened around a shaggy shepherd's neck, then I believe you have found Duke. He belonged to my son Tyler. Tyler was 26 when he died in a farming accident. An old tractor that shouldn't have been running in the first place after the funeral. I couldn't bear to stay in the house. I tried to keep Duke, but grief makes fools of men, and one day he ran. I searched for weeks, but I think he was running too from the silence. From the hurt, I always feared the worst. But if he is with you, if he is safe, then maybe that old tag worked its magic after all. I still live in the same place, a small farmhouse just outside of Ellensburg. If you ever feel inclined to visit, you'd be welcome. I don't expect anything. Just tell him. I never stopped thinking about him." Graham folded the letter carefully, hands trembling slightly. He looked down at Murphy, who was now asleep on the porch step. Chin on his paws, chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. "You have a name," he murmured. "Duke." The sound felt strange in his mouth. Murphy didn't stir, but Graham thought he saw the tip of his tail twitch. Once, just a little later. That night, Graham stood in front of the mirror, holding the brass tag in the light. The inscription on the front still shone clearly. "If you're reading this, I was loved once." And now he knew it was true. The tag had been more than a message. It was a promise, a breadcrumb trail back to something forgotten but not gone. He sat at the kitchen table, map spread out before him, finger tracing a route between Buckley and Ellensburg. It wasn't far, a few hours, maybe just enough distance to mark the years that had passed. Graham leaned down and placed the tag gently on the table beside Murphy's water bowl. "We're going for a drive tomorrow, boy," he said softly. Murphy raised his head, eyes half-lidded, and blinked once. Not a reaction, not an answer, but somehow Graham knew, he understood the road to Ellensburg was lined with gold and rust. October had painted the trees in deep shades of memory, and the air through the open window of the truck smelled like earth and wind. Graham drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally brushing against the brass tag that lay in the cup holder beside him. Murphy Duke maybe sat in the passenger seat, his head low, ears twitching. With every passing mile they reached the farmhouse. Just past noon, it was tucked behind a line of cottonwoods, at the edge of a gravel road. White paint faded to gray porch, sagging in the middle like it had sighed and never recovered. There was a wind chime hanging from the eave, rusty crooked but still catching what little breeze drifted by. Graham parked the truck and killed the engine. Murphy didn't move at first. He simply stared ahead, unmoving, as if taking in something he hadn't seen in years, but still recognized. Then slowly he stepped out. Graham followed behind as Murphy trotted. Not quickly, but with quiet purpose. Toward the porch, the door opened before they reached it. Walter Beckett stood in the frame, like a ghost in the flesh. He was tall, broad in the shoulders. Despite the slump of age, his military posture long softened by years of solitude. His hair was white thin, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the cane. He looked at the dog first, not Graham, just the dog. "Duke," he said, barely louder than a breath. Murphy froze, then with a grace that belied his years, he took one final step forward and pressed his head gently into the man's knee. Walter dropped the cane. He didn't fall, just folded slowly until he was kneeling in the dust, both hands buried in the thick fur of the dog who had once been his son's world. His shoulders shook silent and unyielding as Murphy leaned into him with the steadiness of an anchor. Graham looked away. They stayed like that for what felt like an hour, Walter whispering things Graham couldn't hear. Murphy still as stone, except for the slow sway of his tail against the old wooden porch. Inside, the house smelled of cedar coffee and old books. Walter led them to a worn living room where dust motes danced in the light. Murphy settled beside the fireplace like he'd never left. Walter sat across from Graham in a chair that creaked under the weight of memory. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Walter broke the silence. "He used to sleep right there," he said, nodding toward the hearth. "Every night, my son Tyler, he used to lie with him. Right on that rug. Said Duke didn't like beds. Said the floor was closer to the earth." Graham said nothing, just listened. "After the accident," Walter continued, his voice fraying at the edges, "I tried to keep Duke. I really did. But I wasn't whole. Couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. I yelled more than I should have. He ran one day during a storm. I assumed he was gone. Torn up on the highway. But I kept the picture. The collar." He looked down at his hands, then over at Murphy, who had now turned his cloudy eye toward the fire as if watching something flicker in his own memory. "I used to pray," Walter whispered, "not for forgiveness, just that he'd find someone who needed him again." Graham swallowed hard. "He did," he said. "I didn't know how much I needed him until the day I saw that tag my wife passed 2 years ago, and for a long time I just functioned, taught my classes ate when I remembered. But Murphy Duke, he brought something back. Not loud, not fast, just steady. Like he knew the shape of grief before I did." Walter nodded slowly. "He always did. He used to curl up beside Tyler after a bad day, wouldn't leave until the boy smiled. They understood each other in a way I never quite could." The room fell quiet again. Then Walter stood slower now and shuffled into the hallway. He returned with a small wooden box from it. He pulled out a faded photograph creased at the corners, but still clear. A boy no older than 16 sat on the porch steps, arms wrapped around a young German shepherd, both of them grinning as if the world hadn't touched them yet. Walter handed it to Graham. That was them. Tyler and Duke Summer of '09. Graham stared at the image. Murphy looked younger. Of course, sharper eyes, less gray in his muzzle, but the soul was the same, loyal, present. Still, Walter reached into the box again and pulled out an old leather collar, worn smooth by years of use. The brass tag was missing, but the shape of it had left an impression. "I kept this too," Walter said, voice cracking. "Thought maybe one day he held it out. He's yours now. He said you gave him a second life. He knew where he belonged. That's why he stayed with you." Graham took the collar, hands trembling. For the first time in years, he felt something settle in his chest, like two pieces of a puzzle, finally finding each other in the dark. Murphy patted over. Then, as if summoned by memory, he sat beside Graham, leaned his weight gently into the man's leg, and looked up with the eye that still saw the world. "I don't know what to call him," Graham said, half laughing through the lump in his throat. Murphy Duke Walter smiled. "Call him whatever you like. He already knows who he is outside." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves across the fields inside 3 lives once fractured. They sat together in the quiet, bound by memory, healing and the soft warmth of an old dog who'd found his way home twice by spring. Everyone in Buckley knew the name Murphy, or Duke, or the big quiet shepherd who made you feel seen without saying a word, whatever they called him. It was always with a softness reserved for someone who had left an imprint. He became more than Graham's companion. He became the town's balm at the library. Children who once stammered through sentences now read full chapters with Murphy. Stretched at their feet, the Read with a Friend program grew so quickly that the library expanded it twice. But no matter how many dogs joined it, was Murphy the kids gravitated toward. He didn't flinch at mispronounced words, didn't correct or sigh. He just listened, like every word mattered. At Buckley Elementary, he made his rounds twice a week. Students with sensory needs or anxious minds waited at the door of the calm room just to sit beside him. A boy named Finn, who hadn't spoken to anyone in 6 months, whispered a full sentence into Murphy's fur. One day his teacher cried quietly behind her desk at the Mapleview Senior Living Center. Murphy was a regular. The nurses stopped scheduling him. He simply showed up, and people made time. He would walk through the hallways like he'd been there all along, stopping beside old wheelchairs, pressing his head into wrinkled hands. One resident, Mrs. Albright, who suffered from late-stage dementia, spoke her husband's name aloud for the first time in years. After stroking Murphy's ears for 10 minutes, Walter visited often, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes just to sit quietly on the porch. Beside Graham and Murphy, they didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Walter brought with him old stories and a sense of closure he hadn't known he was missing. He never asked for Duke back. He chose you, he said, once placing a hand on Graham's shoulder. That's all the answer I'll ever need. One Sunday in early June, Murphy slept in a little longer than usual. Graham brewed coffee, set out the usual bowl of softened kibble with a touch of chicken broth, then waited. Murphy didn't come into the kitchen. He didn't appear by the back door like he always did. When the sun hit the porch, Graham found him in the study. Murphy lay curled beside Graham's old leather shoes, his favorite napping spot. His head rested across the toes of the left one, his breath deep, slow, and steady. Graham knelt beside him, ran a hand through his fur. "You okay, buddy?" Murphy didn't stir, but there was warmth, a pulse. Graham sat beside him and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The breathing grew shallower, and then, as the light filtered through the blinds, casting soft lines across the hardwood floor, Murphy exhaled one final time and was still. He didn't struggle, didn't cry. He simply rested like someone who had finished everything they were meant to do. Graham stayed there, hand on his chest, fingers gently tangled in the old dog's coat, tears falling silently. Word spread quickly. By Monday, the town had already begun planning what they called a day for Duke. It wasn't Graham's idea. It was Finn's, the boy who had once only spoken to Murphy. He told his teacher, who told the principal, who called the library, who called the senior center within 2 days. There were flyers printed and posted at every corner store bulletin board and gas station window. The park was filled with folding chairs and picnic blankets. Children held hand-painted signs. Seniors brought framed photos of their therapy sessions. A woman from the library read a poem she wrote called "The Dog Who Listened." Walter stood up, holding the original collar he had given back to Graham, and said simply, he wasn't just a good dog. He was the best kind of reminder that love once given never truly disappears. When it was Graham's turn to speak, he didn't walk to the microphone. He simply held up the brass tag, the same one that started it all, and said he saved me before I even knew I needed saving. Later that week, Graham published his first book. It was a slim volume, bound in a soft cover, the color of Murphy's coat on the title page. It read, "The Dog Who Wore a Brass Tag, for anyone who's ever felt forgotten, and for those who remember with kindness." Inside were stories not just of Murphy, but of those he had touched: Caleb, who now read aloud to his baby sister every night. Mrs. Albright, who passed away weeks later, holding a picture of her and Murphy Finn, who now talked so much. His mother sometimes asked him to take a breath. Walter, who started volunteering at the shelter every Saturday, and Graham himself, who learned late, but not too late, that healing doesn't always come loud or fast. Sometimes it comes on 4 legs, one cloudy eye, and a brass tag that reads, "If you're reading this, I was loved once." A month after Murphy's passing, Graham had the tag engraved with a new line. He placed it in a wooden shadow box on the wall above the fireplace, beneath a photo of Murphy lying in the sun. The tag now read, "I was loved once, and now I helped others feel loved too." Every evening, Graham sat beneath it with a mug of coffee and a quiet heart. He still taught. His classes still walked through town, still stopped by the shelter to check on the dogs, but every so often someone would approach him with a story. A moment when Murphy had simply been there for them, and Graham would add it to the journal he kept on the coffee table, a gift passed along, a legacy carried in silence, a listener who never said a word.